Sorry for the delay. We just had a minor, well, not minor, technical issues. Um, and so we had to postpone, but we haven't canceled. And here we are with the podcast. If you watched the earlier recording slash VOD, I talked about my take on the recent passing of John uh, Peter Bain, also known as Total Biscuit. So I don't want to repeat myself too much. Except I'm just gonna go right to the end of what I said there, and that was thank you to him and to the family and everybody who's been part of the Co-optional Podcast and others for basically encouraging a lot of people, including this podcast, to just go for it, just do the thing, right? Um, he led, like so many others, led the way, and I think other people will be working to fulfill his legacy in their own way. So that's basically all I gotta say about it.
Much about him. Although I did like his ramblings of like, I will talk about X for the next Y minutes. I usually, if those popped up in my recommended list on YouTube, I'd always give those a watch and enjoy them. But so it's unfortunate we won't be getting any more of those. Now our hearts go out to his family and his friends.
Yeah, it's like I said. Also, if you want to have any updates on the situation, his widow, Jenna Bain, has posted a couple of things on Reddit and such, and of course, they talked about his passing on the Co-optional Podcast, which you can watch on Twitch if you're a follower, or I think it will be coming out tomorrow uh, on the YouTube, their YouTube channel. So that's the thing. And I apologize. The audio was from Chapel was a bit off, so I fixed that. So if you hear that on the VOD specifically, like, oh, someone's talking, but we can't hear it. It's setting it up, right? And also, I had a couple of beers, so there's that. Don't do that, kids. It's not healthy. So we have a lot to talk about in terms of news, and perhaps we might squeeze in a little bit of the theme for tonight, which is Allegory and how it's used in video games. Going from, we already talked about the passing of John Bain. Tied to that, there was a series of tweets by a BioWare, a member of the BioWare team, essentially celebrating the death of Total Biscuit.
Yeah, that's very distasteful.
I can understand where they're coming from, but I read some of the tweets and they just came out as being very, well, there's only one way to say it, infantile. Right? It's just like, oh, I have these personal grievances. This critic said things about my games or games I was part of that I didn't like, so now I'm gonna take the time to crap all over them when they're dead. Yeah.
Do you know which games he actually worked on?
I didn't do the research, and sadly, because of the complex figure that was Total Biscuit, Mr. Bain, a lot of people who are reacting to it are from the kind of area of the interwebs that I don't want to be associated with.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it may not even be a particular game he spoke about or gave a bad review. It could just be an industry topic that he talked about that he didn't like.
Yeah, so that could be a thing. I mean, he was a very vocal critic of things he didn't like, which, and I think he also has been lumped into sort of the angry / cynical critics of the interwebs, right? Which, yeah, I guess he was. Well, his public persona was. So, but I think it was cynicism for a good cause. In the cause of alerting people that things are not as they seem. Talking about things that are not what they seem. Yesterday and today, well, today officially this morning, but yesterday there was a stream about the new Fallout game by Bethesda. Fallout 76. Now, I want to bring up my email because there was a discussion of that in the Inquisition Facebook page, and I'm gonna bring someone who is a recent follower of the channel. So welcome to the channel. And I'm not attacking them in any way. In fact, I asked permission to have a discussion. His name is Riley Anderson. He's from Australia, or they're from Australia. Essentially, there's a lot of speculation of what this could be, and among the ideas is that this game is not going to be a mainstream RPG, out of where the other Fallouts have been or the other Bethesda games have been. The most common theory out there pushed by Kotaku is that there's going to be some kind of online game, perhaps an MMO Lite. Riley, on the other hand, posits that it could be some kind of like a Tropico style, um, builder game or strategy game. Which
so almost like a 3D online Fallout Shelter, maybe like
perhaps,
the mobile one they wrote.
Perhaps, although whether it's going to be online or not, it's that's again there's a lot of speculations. I like that idea myself because one of the criticisms I had of Fallout 4 was that the story, and other people had, was the story and the gameplay just didn't match. It's like on one hand you have to do the one thing that's drive you to cross the wasteland of the Commonwealth, and the other's like, oh, build these settlements over here, right? And what we have seen is that it's going to be in Vault 76. So people speculated that it's tied to the year 2076, which would be the 300th anniversary of the founding or the founding of the United States of America. And according to the video they shown, that's basically it's one of the control vaults, and their job is to go out and restart humanity after the war. So it could be the ultimate prequel, right? It could be the prequel because original Fallout was 70 years after the Holocaust, or the post-apocalypse, or 70 years into the post-apocalypse. This would be 20 years, and it would be in the Virginia area, whether it's West Virginia or in the DC area. Again, there's a speculation that Vault 76 was in the DC area, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
Yeah, the trailer had a song I don't recognize. I'm not entirely sure, but it kept saying West Virginia a lot. So
West Virginia.
They tend not to be very subtle with their musical choices. So,
of course, that also means that they're just chucking out of the window their own established canon since Fallout 3, which it depends. I mean, again, this is a teaser trailer for probably going to be an announcement on E3, and I don't see them announcing the game coming out this year the way they did with Fallout 4. I'm probably saying, okay, this is going to come out the year after that because, if they're using, hopefully they're using a new engine and all that, because the engine that used Fallout 4 was basically the same engine as Skyrim, and that one has shown its age, right? It's being used and overused by Bethesda a bit too much. Although I think even the game itself has been announced not to be made by Bethesda Softworks either, but one of their affiliates. So it could be something completely different. I doubt very much that they're going to go the route of Elder Scrolls Online. I mean, that still is, ESO is still out there, but it's not a big moneymaker for them. I mean, that doesn't seem like they're making a lot of money out of it, but it's still it's being sustained, I suppose. Maybe that's one reason why we didn't get another Elder Scrolls games, because the ESO is still out there, so they're hoping that they can continue that. So I think it's too early today, but Riley brought some important ideas, so I wanted to mention them, and also I got permission for them to mention them in the podcast. So there you go, Riley, and welcome to the program and the channel. Other games that have been announced have been 2 games, to sort of, again, side games for the Switch in the Pokemon family. And some people were upset because they wanted another, I don't know, mainstream game at Pokemon Gold or Silver or Platinum or whatever. I've never actually been a Pokemon player. I think I watch a little bit of the cartoon here and there, and it's like, okay, it's I get what they're trying to do, but it just was way too late for my childhood, right? To me to get. I mean, if I'd been younger, if I'd been at the right age, I would probably be crazy in Pokemon, and Pokemon is something that is sort of continues with an audience, like people who are now going to the 30s are still playing Pokemon because they like Pokemon, right? And
Yep.
it's a good fit with the Switch, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens there, but um, it's very interesting, to say the least. Um,
Yeah, I tend to keep my eye on Pokemon. Kind of, as like a former big Pokemon fan, I just kind of I keep my ear pressed to the ground, but I don't really follow it. Usually I'm aware that a new Pokemon game's coming out because I start seeing fan art of like the same same character showing up. Like, oh, that's supposed to be a Pokemon. Okay,
mm,
there's a new Pokemon game coming out. Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, as a I pretty much kind of stopped following Pokemon after the third generation. I kind of tried to get it back into the fourth, and then I just couldn't. It just doesn't grab me as it used to.
Yeah,
I still like some of the old characters, but that's about it.
yeah, it's Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. Uh,
So I didn't look into this week's news on those two games. So I'm kind of curious because from the rumors, it was supposed to be a reboot of Pokemon Yellow. So
mm,
Pokemon Yellow is actually it's trying to make the original game, but kind of put in elements of the anime.
mm,
So there's some character references. You get all the three starter Pokemon from the original game, but you start off with Pikachu, and it's just it kind of shoves in references in there from the TV show. And now Eevee, it's sort of like the TV show's rival. Eventually, you never know which Pokemon he originally got,
mhm.
but then halfway through the series, or at least after a couple hundred episodes, he just has an Eevee, and that's like his primary, like his Pikachu,
Mm.
essentially. So that's where the Eevee and the Pikachu come from.
Sorry about
So
that.
now, so now I'm kind of wondering if they're going to shove in more elements of the TV show, or if those elements are still even there.
But I guess the thing is about the anime, the American version of the anime and the Japanese version of the anime have some. They have diverged over the years, and there's been many animes and versions, and there's been movies and all that. So which one would it be? I guess.
Yeah, is it going to go for like the original run
Hmm.
that kind of try to parrot the TV or the plot of the video game, or is it? I don't know. We'll see. We're probably not going to pick that game up, unfortunately, for
Yeah,
Nintendo, anyways.
yeah. I mean, it's this is we're running up to the talk about E4. E3, I said E3. So we're talking about that, and that means that we're going to see more and more news. For another piece of news is Battlefield 5 will not have loot boxes, apparently.
Hmm.
Of course,
So
that doesn't mean there's not going to have microtransactions because it
yeah,
will. Uh, but that's the thing. So are we seeing a trend? This is actually a trend of reversals on loot boxes, or you think that maybe it's just
no,
a small
I
PR
think
move? Yeah.
I think it's a small PR move, and
Mm.
if anything, if there are microtransactions, there's going to be the cosmetic only ones that you don't have to buy into a loot box. You just give $1 or two, and you get the skin for your
Mhm.
multiplayer avatar or something.
Yeah. And also talk about Battlefield 5. There seems to be, an internet controversy. Let's talk about that. The fact that in the cover there is a woman. And some people go, well, my historical immersion has been destroyed. And I'm like,
E- Even though the first one wasn't historically accurate at all.
none of them have been. No Call of Duty, no Battlefield. I mean, some of them have sort of dipped a bit more into it, but the thing about the FPS, let's talk about FPS here. You get shot by a assault rifle couple times, or shot one assault rifle,
Just
depending.
one or two shots.
One or two shots, and you just slug them up, and I'll take this health kit, or I'm just gonna hide. And I mean, realism hasn't really been there in service of gaming, right? So I doubt very much you can actually say with a straight face that my realism has been ruined.
Oh no, yeah, women didn't play a big part in the front lines of World War II, but I'm like, this is a fictionalized version. We also didn't run around with blimps and tanks in the first World War, or have like automatic assault rifles of some sort in the first game, which is supposed to be World War One. And so like, I think it makes sense if this continuity doesn't follow our history, because it clearly doesn't already.
Yeah, and I also think it's a matter that something has been talked about in the past, is that there are limits to the old audience, right? Of the 15 to 30-year-old white male, and you have to expand, right? And you have to acknowledge that other people exist, and we talked about this in before. So it's like, yeah, no, we're not gonna, we're just gonna acknowledge that and move on. In other news, a little bit of a news, Project Wingman had its Kickstarter trailer come out, and it's like, what are we talking about here? Well, Project Wingman essentially is the Ace Combat game that a lot of people have been asking on for a very long time, particularly on PC. Ace Combat 6 or 7, I think, has been promised to come out sometime in the future, but it hasn't come out. And so this game looks like it's going to be the thing. I downloaded, there's three missions that you can download as a demo as part of the Kickstarter, and it's just Project Wingman, and it basically looks and sounds like a straight up copy of Ace Combat. In terms of, you have like giant motherships and the fighters and all that, and the voices and all that. I suppose we'll see if it runs into any legal problems, but I doubt it, because it's a fighter game. I mean, Ace Combat, basically what it did was bring games that had been around since the 1980s in PC and home computers, brought it to the console in a pretty spectacular way, right? Very flashy way, very arcadey way. And so I never played all the Ace Combats myself. Maybe I should, because I love that genre. And maybe I would actually appreciate a more arcadey feel, because playing a combat flight sim, it's the old-fashioned way. It's a steep learning curve, to say the least. So I'm looking forward to it, seeing how it works. Another news, and this might tie into what we were talking tonight, but not yet. Is that also Detroit becoming human? Sorry. Well, before we do that, there was a game that came out called a active shooter.
Oh.
Which is supposed to recreate as the term goes, a shooting in a American high school, and you could have played the role. It was for PC, role of of one of the shooters, or the
SWAT team.
The SWAT team
that's trying to neutralize them.
Yeah. Now, again, it brings one of those terms of what is allowed, what isn't allowed, and I think the confluence here, the real, I think a lot of people are taking issue with this, is that video games are still under attack of the moral guardians.
Yeah.
And deliberately making a game that sort of invokes the very fears of said moral guardians, as well as, in many ways, re-victimizing some of the people who have suffered from things from Parkland and some other places, it's not a good idea. And so there were a lot of calls on Steam to basically push it out, cancel it. And considering that last week or the week before, we also had a huge, attempt at censoring adult games, or visual novels with adult themes in it, and maybe some nudity. it's sort of, it's a whole discussion of violence and sexuality in games and in media in
Yeah.
general. What you prefer?
Violence is good, but oh no, sex is bad.
Yeah. And Steam pulled it out, pulled it, but I think the reason has nothing to do with um,
The content of the game,
game
it's
itself, but because BC Interactive, well-known asset flipper, was involved with them, and they already have been banned from Steam. So apparently they repackaged the game under a different name and put it on Steam. And because Steam has such a low bar for entry, they got away with it. And it's like, oh, but then, with everybody commenting on it, it's like they gave it a second look. It's like, oh, you guys are involved in this. So we don't want that. We don't want to be associated with that. And oh, by the way, it also helps um, that we're not seeming to be promoting school shootings in the process.
yeah.
So
And that's not to say that a game about school shootings and the tragedy couldn't work. I think it could, but you would have to tread very lightly and carefully. Like I could see that some sort of happening if you approach it from like a mental illness kind of way. And honestly, it would probably make more sense as a visual novel in terms of mental illness, depression, or what factors would lead to someone being raised. And honestly, we can probably say one of the greatest times to be alive in America with all our technological marvels and whatnot. And what would lead someone to do something like that? I think that would make a very interesting game. But the way this particular game was going to brush this topic, no, that's not their intent.
yeah, it seems that they're going to just profit from it as opposed to just. And again, we talk about war games. We talk about things. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, for example, World War II games are now becoming popular game, but games in set in Vietnam, for example, never really were become popular because
No.
the feel of it, it's very difficult to put yourself as a hero in Vietnam as opposed to
Yeah,
World
and
War II.
especially since that's a particular war that we don't feel we won. At least in America, we don't feel like we won or accomplished the mission.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and modern warfare also tends to obscure some. It deals with, but doesn't obscure and doesn't go right like oh you're going to Iraq or you're going to this or you're going to that, right? Which I think brings to us back to Detroit becoming human and the power or lack thereof of Allegory. Now, before we get into the specifics, we talked about this last week, and there was a release of the Quantic Dreams game because I'm no people's like, oh, you're being a jackass about it, but I have to be. I mean, that's how I feel about it. Quantic Dreams product, latest product, an exclusive to PS4, Detroit becoming human.
We'll call it an interactive media.
Which it purports to tell the story or different stories related to the existence of androids in the near future and how they are treated therein. Although the president of Quantum Dreams didn't said specifically, supposedly, I have to check my sources for that it's so again put an asterisk on that it wasn't designed to be an allegory, say segregation and other situations. But that's not the only game that has done it. Last year we had Deus Ex Human, Mankind Divided. Of course, the games that we talked about ourselves a lot with BioWare games, Dragon Age, and Mass Effect have similar allegories to racism and poverty and other, social issues, and many other games, right? And other forms of media as well, right? And first of all, I think we have to start with defining what is or isn't allegory in the sense, because there's one thing about having a certain element, right? If you're world building a fantastic or fictional world and you include things like racism, slavery, poverty, social inequality. In many ways, you just put them there because it makes things more relatable, right? Nobody
Mm-hmm.
wants to play in a perfect little world, or at least modern gaming would have us have at least shades of gray, which means that living in a place where everybody treats themselves equally and there's no resentment and it means basically where's the conflict, where's the social aspect of conflicts, right? um, so in that sense, when we're talking about allegory, um, we are talking about we're not talking about just having those elements in the game,
Yeah.
um, but we're talking about allusions to real life problems. And this is something that science fiction has been doing for decades. Uh, on one hand, one could argue is that it's a good way to approach difficult subjects.
Mm-hmm. I especially think of allegories for in children's books. Something that you kind of lay down a foundation of social issues that you may not want to introduce in a outright introduce these complex issues to a child, but kind of get it, but you want to give them an idea or an impression, or give them just kind of plant the seed of what sort of social issues can arise in society, but in a way that can kind of understand without being too complex for their age.
And also
Like
give,
I,
yeah, give them the language to deal with it
yeah,
as well.
and
Yes.
of course, not every allegory has to be a issue to something related to real life in terms of social issues. Like I think of like Narnia, which had the famous allegory of Jesus Christ as Aslan the lion.
Yeah.
A lot of Christian ideals being put in there that without really saying what they are, and just kind of like, oh hey, he died for these kids and then came, or died for one, essentially he died for Judas and came back to life.
Yeah, but I think which brings it to an aspect of allegory, and that is, while it can be useful, it's who is it useful for? Because I think the main use of allegory is for kind of people who don't experience it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm gonna say this, particularly white middle class and upper middle class people, men and women, of the heterosexual persuasion, right?
Yep.
Because the way it can come off is thus: this could happen to you, right? This is a warning. This could happen to you, but it also kind of serves like a dodge, because
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, yes, this could happen to you, and that's a threat and something you consider. And the reason why that's important is that we find it very difficult to relate to anything as human beings unless it's personal on some level, right? If we haven't experienced something directly, it's kind of hard to go like, okay, I may empathize with people suffering from this or that, but I don't really know what they're really going through.
Yeah, like let's take something like a death of a child. Like neither you or I, as far as I know,
Hmm.
have a child, so we can empathize with a parent's loss of a child, but we won't really know. We can't know that connection of what it is to lose a child,
Hmm.
because it's we have not gone through it, and we don't have that connection with another living being.
Yeah, at that level. But on the other hand, I think it also can serve as a cover for actually confronting these issues, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, if you're gonna talk about racism, it's a difference between, say, putting fantasy racism against elves or dwarves or humans or whatever in a fantasy game, and say Mafia 3, which is says this is 1960s, or Wolfenstein, something like that. This is 1960s. People spoke this way. These attitudes were real. This is what was happening to a degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
Necessarily, you have to go into a deep discussion, but it's there. It's not allegory. It's straight there. but it makes us uncomfortable, right? I mean, to realize that these things are there, and our relationship with that situation, if anything, right? What are we doing or we're failing to do?
Yeah,
Uh,
especially when you start to think like, are do I still see these issues in the present time?
mhm. And it also can serve maybe to blind us, right? Because it's like, oh, we see the allegories. Oh, how unfortunate is that people were there, and maybe we might relate to the past, like, oh, these things that used to happen, which is also part of the part of the problem. Is yeah, it's in the 1960s or in World War II, alternate World War II, whatever. Oh well, yeah, the Nazis were doing this. How horrible! But because we use allegory today for a lot of these things, it's very easy to like, but what's happening today? And also, I think it's also a matter of comfort zones. It allows, again, mainly white male writers in video games and other media
Mm,
to talk about these things without falling into the pitfalls of, well, how do I write a female character going through this? How do I write a person of color going through this? How do I write someone from the LGBT community going through this, right? Without, like we talked about this before in the program, without falling into tokenism and stereotyping and all that. Um, how do I deal with this? Well, I don't know. I don't have those experiences, and I don't want to be the kind of person who goes like, well, I have this one black friend that knows this stuff, I guess, so I'm gonna bring them in, which has been also criticism of Detroit in a sense. Is like it's very heavy-handed on one side, but also misses a lot of the points on the other, right? Particularly in
mhm.
a city like Detroit, which is that's one of the things I found it very interesting, the choice of place. And if you know anything about Detroit, the area, and the current situation, I cannot imagine in 10 or 20 years those things disappearing by miracle, right?
Yeah, it's almost like the sort of like every sci-fi sort of has that thing where, oh no, we discovered that we as humans discovered that aliens are out there, and now racism among us doesn't exist at all, and now we're all racist against the aliens and
Yeah.
stuff.
It reminds me, ironically enough, another very good novel, a tie-in novel to the Shadowrun universe. Back in the days where FASA owned Shadowrun and FASA existed, it was a very good novel, but it did deal with that in a sense of the action took was in a sort of futuristic um, South Africa.
Hmm.
And what was interesting about it was that in the Shadowrun universe, you have the sort of meta humans accompanying. You have orcs and elves and dwarves and goblins and all these things that have been infected by some kind of disease or syndrome. And so the new racism, right, is directed at orcs and whatnot because they clearly are different. Um, and in fact, there was even a movie in Netflix that was something like that. I forgot the title of the movie. Chad might remember. Um, and
Oh, is it Bright?
Bright, yeah, Bright. People actually call it the Shadowrun movie because it's kind of like that. Urban fantasy, modern urban fantasy. In this case, it's cyberpunk meets urban fantasy in Shadowrun. But this particular novel said, yeah, those things exist, but in South Africa, and this was in the, well, I think the novel was written in the 90s. There's still the idea of, you are belonging to this particular tribal group. You're black as well, or white as well as an orc, as well as a dwarf, as well as, I don't know,
Hmm.
a vampire or something like that, right? That just because you have new groups, and I think the argument there, like you made with the aliens, is like, oh well, this is greater threat, so we humans have to sort of band together and, um, deal. It's better to protect humanity as a whole, so we're gonna reconfigure our way we think about humanity because we have a bigger threat to deal with. Um, I think one of the things, for example, in Mass Effect, bringing out the old canard, I don't think that the slavery there is necessarily a allegory for our slavery.
Yeah,
It's
the
just there. It's aliens who practice slavery, and a lot of people who practice slavery, including humans, right? Because it's
yeah, and of course,
profitable and that sort of thing. So it's
and of course
not.
Yeah, they even had like the legalized slavery, which was
Hmm.
the indentured servant, and I mean it was barely there even. It's
Yeah.
just brought up with the one Korean on the one planet, and that was that.
I don't think that was ever meant. That was meant, I think, on the first category of, hey, we're constructing this universe, and the universe has bad things in it, and one of them is slavery. It was never really, there was not really enough there to make the comparison. Although I think people have said, hey, I think one of the TV tropes pages is like humanity has a big problem with slavery because they experience slavery among them, and it becomes a thing that is seen as a big fault in them. Of course, being victims of slavery by aliens doesn't help. But
Hmm.
there was not enough there to construct an allegory, because you need to have enough of it to be sustainable. Going back to Detroit, there's literally a scene I seen in GIFs where a public bus comes in and it has a section for androids. Like, oh, androids go here, the doors open, and they just sort of stand there. They just stand there because they're androids. I don't need to sit. So it's a section for androids, and androids have become this sort of. There's one character that pushes for becoming humans, acceptance of
Yeah.
androids' rights, and does that and this and that, and you can explore that story. There's another. It's very interesting because one of them acts as just a maid to a poor family, or a single father, and has to deal with
Hmm.
domestic abuse and all that. Another one serves as a police officer or a member of the police, or a member of the enforcement laws and all that. And then you have the third character, which serves as sort of
The
the
revolutionary.
revolutionary. And that particular character is played by a character, in fact, including the face and the voice, who is a mixed race. He's biracial.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of like something I noticed. Like I don't like from the trailers. I'm like all I ever saw were like all these androids appear to be white. Like are they saying that like only the androids are all the same color? Like oh no, white slavery. But no, I'm looking at the wiki and there seems to be more mixed race
Yeah,
androids.
which also I think would have been an interesting. I mean, if you want to go beyond the allegory, I think that would have been an interesting take on this. Like, why is it that many of these androids are white? And that's
Hmm.
because you could make the argument that because we prefer as a society the traits and beauty marks of being white Western European, then our
Or
androids would be looking like that because that's what we perceive as being the thing that we want to emulate.
yeah, or we want an android to look more like our family, and more white people have more money to actually afford these androids, therefore most of them look white. You
Yeah.
could say something, an argument about that, but I'm sure that's not in the game.
No, but and that's the thing. It's like sometimes there's another aspect allegory. It sort of can gets in the way of making the real arguments, right? Taking the elements that you have is like, well, just put them out there. Wolfenstein 3D, the latest Wolfenstein that came out, it actually deals with a lot of situations, and it doesn't shy from saying, yeah, the Nazis are bad and they're racist and they're horrible and want to conquer the world, but hey, look at America, right? Look at the fact that you have running around these guys with hoods that believe in racial superiority. Look at the fact that a lot of white Americans in this the town, which is sort of a small town America, really, even though the Sims are under occupation, they have embraced the idea of slavery, of bringing back slavery, right? And it's almost one of the characters, and the spoilers for this game, sells another character to because that character was Jewish, right? And they face these things head on, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and I think, yeah, it's an alternate history which allows them to maneuver. And I think also one of the reasons why, because the designers, most of them were not Americans. Where if you are an American, although the people who make Quantum Dreams are mostly French, um, but the French also have a very complicated history about colonialism and imperialism and race and all that. So I guess they don't want to reflect that, in their own history by way of the United States. They have more room to maneuver in that sense. Where I think a American or even Canadian designer primarily making a game for an American market might go like, maybe I don't want to do that because it's gonna compromise my sales. Going back to the idea of the 15 to 30-year-old demographic, white demographic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And
Go ahead.
I think allegories have to be are more important than say triple A productions because by their very nature they have to be successful. They have to sell these copies so they can't alienate any. They have to try to avoid alienating any sort of audience.
Mm-hmm.
Take for example, um, you just played it, Far Cry 5.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this a minor controversy about essentially the antagonist being a form of a Christian based cult of some sort. However, if you play the game, I believe that there isn't really a reference to Christianity at all. It's just mostly implied. It's sort of like the dangers of a vague uh cultish mentality, isn't it?
Well, one of the good guys is clearly a preacher, a
Mm-hmm.
Protestant preacher, a black Protestant preacher. So he does quote the Bible. In fact, he says basically because the cult has their own sort of Bible.
Yeah, but so this is a protagonist though, not
Yeah,
an
no,
antagonist.
no,
That's
it's one of the allies, one of the NPCs, and but the villains, they sometimes quote strict scripture, but in a very loosely kind of way, right? They don't seem to be following like, oh, I don't, following a specific idea. And in fact, they posit that the bad guys in the game, one of the reasons why they're not true Christians is that they have their own book, the book of John C. That's a new Bible for them, right? So this cult, and they mix and match a lot of things, like, flower children, but also you have your war vets, and you have your sort of formally there's a stance that the leaders of these two brothers are sort of like these guys that went out into the world, and they're pretty boys who had sex and drugs and all these things, and then sort of like that wasn't satisfying for them, so now they're basically what we call like metrosexual in the old
yeah.
parlance. Like, the leader has a lot of tats, and he wears like these douchey sunglasses, and
So
has a man bun, right?
so this almost sounds like this. You could have made this allegory to almost from based on what you're telling me. You could have made this an allegory to Mormonism because Mormonism is sort of Christian, but then it has its own book and their
Yeah.
own beliefs. So it almost sounds like an extremist cultish version of Mormonism. So and that sort of leads into another thing that allegory can you have to kind of talk about allegory is where do you draw the line between what the author intended with their work and what the audience reads into it. So,
Yeah.
like, just based on what you're saying, and maybe if I even play the game, like, oh, these cultish people are clearly supposed to be an allegory for the dangers of Mormonism, let's just say, and it's like, oh, so I guess I guess Ubisoft is anti-Mormonism, or at least the writer is, because I guess Mormons are crazy like that, making up weird parts of Christianity. I mean,
Yeah.
you can read.
I mean, they claim to have made a lot of research on cults, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you do see a lot of that, like the use of drugs and stuff like that, and isolating people and whatnot. Although the drugs become like pretty magical in how they can actually
Yeah.
affect people, so it's very exaggerated, and PTSD and whatnot. But at the same time, there's another things like these are the villains. So who are the heroic faction? Well, the heroic faction is salt of the earth. Mostly, although there's again variety in race and ethnicity, but mostly white Americans in rural America who have guns. In fact, a couple of times characters will just throw out the lines like, "Well, I used to be, against the Second Amendment, but thank God I have the Second Amendment now." It's like the idea that you need guns to protect yourself and against these crazy cultists, and the police can help you. Like, literally, the police sort of break down. The government is nowhere to be seen. So it's so in many ways it plays out to a lot of right wing propaganda about gun
Americanism.
Americanism, and then of course there's the whole end. I mean,
Oh
it's
no.
it's a mess. It's a mess. That's what I would
Yeah,
describe it.
now
Right?
now it's sort of seeing like what were you guys trying to say with this? So are you saying religion's bad, or you but no, because some of the good guys are religious, and then so now we're kind of lead into like what's a muddled mess and what's actually allegory.
I think, and I would suggest people watching this podcast would go to Aaron Signal's take on Far Cry 5 and the art of saying nothing. That's a video that he put out. Uh, Again, I think he was trying to say we don't. I think Far Cry 5 tried not to be an allegory of anything, right?
Hmm.
Like, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, it just wanted a set backdrop for whatever setting. I guess like a justification for why the game takes place where it takes place and why you're fighting who you're fighting, but it didn't try to say anything profound.
Yeah, it's still. I mean, that's the thing. It's like you have enough of a story, you're going to make statements, right? You're going to make statements
Yeah.
about who your enemies are. If, for example, let's say I'm playing in a game in the 1980s where the Soviets are the bad guys, right? Then, and I'm an American ninja or something, right? Then I'm making a statement, even by that simple setting or premise. Um, and I think allegory also becomes very important nowadays because video games, especially in AAA space, are trying to be grown up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And trying to move away from the McKinney, binary of whoever the faction or factions that are with the hero, or the protagonist, the player characters, are by definition heroes and they're good, and whoever you're fighting are bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the past, you wouldn't have allegory. You would have like I don't know a torture scene or a kidnapping or something. It's like this is a bad person, and they're bad because
They're
they're
doing bad things.
yeah, but they're communists or they're bad because they're religious or because they're atheists or whatever it is they decided that would be things. So there was no room for allegory. But I think the problem now is that because games suffer from being anything but subtle, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the past, and that's subtlety is a thing of the fact that you have to signal post to the player what they should do next makes it subtlety a very difficult thing to do, and also subtlety is one of those things that's like you know it when you see it, right? If either it's not subtle at all or it's too subtle, you don't see it at all. So it can fail in
Yeah.
both ways. But because of that, I think video games have tried, and again, because they also want to appeal to the widest audience possible, that we're going to be gray and gray, right? Everything's gray. We don't take any moral stance. Ergo, creating allegories for racism and slavery and oppression and political persecution and LGBTQ oppression or marginalization of different groups, that would mean unless we make it in a sort of very extremely fantastical way, rather than a fantasy races or sci-fi races, we run the risk of offending members of our audience, and so turn them off and not making the kind of sales that we want to make. So
Yeah.
yeah, which brings us, I think, to another kind of space which we might see more allegories of, and that's the indie spaces and the AA spaces, right?
Yeah. And I feel that those kind of spaces probably take more risk with their allegory and maybe even drop just the allegory altogether and just outright say what they're trying to say is up front.
I think a good example of that, well, game again, I put an asterisk on it, but it's a product, it's out there, and it certainly has game-like elements. It's Into the Woods,
Hmm. I
and
haven't played that one yet, but yeah, I've heard good things about that.
I don't want to spoil too much because I saw the full gameplay, but it does have allegory in the sense of sort of the downturn of Middle America, town of Middle America, but in other
Mm-hmm.
places, because it has, for example, LGBTQ characters, it doesn't have any allegories. Just straight up says, being gay in a in small town America is hard,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you have to deal with poverty and you have to deal with family abuse and all that. There's one character that's very quiet kind of character. Literally, the character's a bear. Um, so there's that. And when they speak about family abuse and all that and neglect, and their boyfriend talks about well, I'm working on a shitty little job and we're just getting our money together to see if we can get out of this town because there's nothing much to do and stuff like that. And I think it's able to take those risks, or what seems to be risky, because it is a smaller product that doesn't concern itself with selling millions and millions of copies, right? A success would be 100,000 copies or something like that. So it can aim lower, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, and some other things as well. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, and I've played like plenty of LGBTQ games. They just outright say what prejudice against gays, and there's no allegory for fantasy characters. Although sometimes they do involve fantasy characters, but they're not an allegory for their sexuality. They're just there.
And also, I think it's also the intersection between allegory and representation. Um,
Hmm.
for example, one thing I found very interesting about Dragon Age Inquisition was the character of Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the Dragon Age universe, gay people exist. It just happens. It's gay, and then later on we also know that transsexual characters exist and whatnot. What I found very interesting, and it ironically goes into quote unquote historical accuracy, is that because it is vaguely modeled in Western European Middle Ages
Yeah.
and the Renaissance, the idea of the upper classes being obsessed with, fathering children,
Bloodlines.
right, and therefore having a future, meant that while it might be acceptable, and Dorian essentially is one of the aspects of Dorian. Spoilers for the character. In fact, named Dorian, as in Dorian Gray, it's also there.
Yeah.
And that his father basically said, "Oh, you could do whatever you wanted to do in private, but in public, you should have a wife and you should attempt to have children because it's the legacy. It's what he's called your fucking legacy." That's
Yep.
a direct quote. There's another side story, lower story, where one of the sons of nobility essentially, there's a villa, and that villa was designed so that the son could go out and be with his boyfriend in the villa,
Mm-hmm.
and then in public when he took over he could be with his wife, whoever happens to be the wife, and so he could have his kids and all that. So he could literally have his father created for him two castles, the one he's living in and the villa, in order so he could have this double life, because it was necessary for him to father children and have a legacy to maintain the family and the wealth in the family, otherwise it would die out. Although I guess there's no rules for adoption in Dragon Age
Yes.
universe,
Or artificial insemination, surrogate parents.
Yeah, I guess not. Well, with magic, I suppose. Uh,
Turkey baster.
but is there, and it kind of makes sense, at least to me, in that you would have a situation where the rich and powerful would have, they may have gay. The poor might be as gay as they want to be because nobody cares, where they keep their money or not. But the rich and powerful want to keep both appearances and their power in that social strata.
Yeah, sort of like in the first game, if you can marry the queen or be her essentially her consort prince, or her,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're a male, and but if you were a male, like say of dwarven ability, she kind of like, huh, that's interesting, but no, it wouldn't work. Like, sorry, can't do it.
Yeah.
Because it's probably also a legacy thing, even though the dwarf is of nobility, or could be.
and I guess dwarves and I don't know. That's one aspect of Dragon Age.
Crossbreeding. Well,
Yeah,
they had a half elf, half human character in the second game.
yeah,
He's and it's sort. I think it's speculated that Sandrol is maybe half human, half dwarf, maybe, and that's why he might have this weird magic thing around him, despite being a dwarf.
and I think there's a side quest in Dragon Age 2 with two sons that they're fighting. They're two dwarven sons,
Mm-hmm.
and when you meet them, I think the mother is an elf, and the father's a dwarf, or she's a human. I'm not really sure, but you don't know. You're not really sure if they, they were sons. They were their sons, and then he married this woman, or actually she gave birth to them. It's never specified. So Dragon Age, when it comes to dwarves and reproduction, yeah, the Dragon Age lore is not as specific as it is with elves. But even with elves, example, because the thing about elves is that if an elf and a human get together, they're compatible sexuality to do that, reproduce that is, the child will always be human.
Mm-hmm.
They may have some elven traits, perhaps, but if they're not visible and they're considered to be human, which is one of the things about the elves is like, no, we can't have this intermixing with humans because I think we're not only going to lose our immortality. We lost them, perhaps because of marriage and all that, but also because we're going to have human kids, which means the elves are going to die out.
Or it could be a cultural thing, like, oh no, we're going to lose our cultural representation, especially if they're those elves, the Dalish elves that are trying to stay true to their roots.
Well, also, literally, they could die out. I mean, if your children don't look like you, they're not elven. Although, of course, elven culture might be something that they can sustain with biology and culture and all that. Then you run the risk of dying out as a distinct race. But the Dragon Age lore on relationship between humans and dwarves and elves, and it's all over the place. Which again is another aspect of Allegory because of Dalish as seen as slaves, but also as sort of indentured servants and as a servant class to humans, even in places where it's technically illegal to have slaves, but they're kept in essentially ghettos. And the Dalish elves are, and could be said, an allegory for the Romani, right? The Roma, known most people colloquially as gypsies, but that's seen as a slur nowadays, which you have to respect that. At least I try to, and stuff like that. Even Mass Effect, because on one hand you have, slavery is not an allegory, but then you have the Quarians, who are people who are wandering and are despised by a minority and despised and treated as always being criminals and all that.
Yeah, they seem to be an allegory for the Roma. Although I'm not entirely sure what they were trying to say with them, because I don't think Roma lost the country, did they?
No,
to robots.
No. But they also tend to have like Jewish roots as well, right? So only some of the words and terminology as well. So again, it's allegory is used. I think my final word. We're now coming to the bottom of the hour at 11 o'clock Eastern here. Allegory can be useful, but it has severe limitations. And I think it's time for the video game industry to wake up to those limitations. We can't simply just keep doing this and avoiding the real issues. Even if tackling the real issues can be be done clumsily or even miss the mark, but at least you try. So I apologize to all our viewers for the delay, but we still did the program, so here we are.
Yeah, so we're public service announcement. Be careful of the latest Windows update.
Yes,
it seemed to have killed all my devices.
Yeah.
Most of them.
So before we go, where we can find you on the interweb, Chapamon?
You can find me at Chopamon pretty much everywhere. I'm Chopamon on YouTube, and I am Chopamon _Aragon on Twitch and Twitter.
And you can find me here on the Lesson Learned podcast and Lesson Learned One channel. The one is important. We're playing the Virgin Run of Dark Souls 1
Mm.
remastered on the PC. Never played a Dark Souls game before. I, of course, dying a lot, so you can see that. And also, you can watch some of the VODs also on the Lessons Learned YouTube channel and on Twitter under Lessons Learned or Rafa Writer. So thank you all for coming, and as always, we will see you when we see you. Have a very good night.
Good night, everybody.